This is part one of a presentation and discussion about China Global Innovation Superpower, which we did with Professor Yiping Liu and with myself, Andrew Gaule.
I lead AIMAVAR. We've been running a series of these sessions and sort of discussions now for since the lockdown has sort of come about. But typically, myself, Samantha, and colleagues run roundtables, and we run programs and that in other countries. So Samantha and I were in China in November. We've been running roundtables around some of the topics that we're going to talk about today, like the electric vehicle space and data and patents and innovation and that sort of within China. In the Chinese style of QR codes, which I'll come to in that later, if you're watching on your laptop and you have your phone available, open the camera, and if you show the camera to the QR code, most phones these days now will pop up with a link, and if you connect on that, you'll see the information that's coming up as I go through this presentation, or you connect with LinkedIn or sort of stuff like that. But for those of you who've been to China and those of you who know China, this is such an important part of the ecosystem and that there. So I published a book a couple of years ago called Purpose to Performance, and how value chains are changing due to technologies and business models. And the reason I highlight this is because in the book, I've got a chapter which is titled Global Innovation Superpowers. I've got basically in that chapter, I've got about one sentence about Silicon Valley, about a paragraph about Israel, and the rest of the chapter is about China. And that's some of the context and discussion that we're gonna have today. In terms of just to highlight some of the areas that we've worked in and that there, so I've been back and forth to China and worked in China for about 17 years. Some of the things here run workshops for executives from China and from Western sort of corporates. One I'd like to highlight, which I'll come back to a little bit later, in 2015, we ran a program there, and we had the mayor of Minhang. Minhang is the second sort of most wealthiest district in Shanghai. We've got Pudong, which some of you know where the international airport is, and where there's a lot of science parks. Minhang is on the western side of Shanghai. It's got the high-speed train link to Beijing and down to Shenzhen. It's got the domestic airport and the Asian sort of airport hub, and it's got what claims to be one of the world's largest exhibition centers. And on the left-hand side here, there was this group of sort of Western corporates from the program that I was leading. On the right-hand side of this U table says the mayor of Minhang, and we were sort of discussing developments and that within his district. And he said, "Oh, let me tell you about what we're doing because we'd like your advice." And then he went on to say that in 2016 they were planning to build 25 smart robot factories in his district, and they were moving Unilever's manufacturing out of his district because it was too low tech, and the brand and that. We'll come back to some of that later. And when Samantha and I were in Shanghai and Shenzhen, and that in November last year, we'll highlight some of the things that we saw there around electric vehicles and technologies that changes. So what's the economic outlook? What's some of the current sort of situation to put the context of China and this innovation superpower in the context of the current pandemic and the economy? Some of you might have seen in the press and in the news and that today, this taken from the BBC website on the left-hand side, GDP growth in China has just rebounded to 3.2% after a drop in the first quarter of a drop of sort of 6.8%. Now, we can take GDP figures with a pinch of salt, but I think it's not necessarily what the absolute figure is there, but how is China relative to the West over time and during this pandemic. And the economist items there in terms of China's, the OECD forecast for China having a growth, small, but in June, compared to the drastic drops that we're seeing in the US, Europe, and Britain. So how is that going to play into the current environment and how things are changing? So some examples that I highlighted in my book around what are the types of innovations that are occurring. And some of you might be familiar with the three horizons. Horizon 1, what's your current business? Horizon 2, what are the incremental changes? And Horizon 3, how is technology and business models going to be transformed? So some examples here. So in the energy and transport sort of space, transforming from large power stations, old technology with coal and oil powered, to new energy saving, to what's going to happen with a distributed energy sort of system. So examples of solar power, wind power, electric vehicles, distributed energy sort of management type systems. And I think one of the things we want to consider when we're talking about, in the context of this, which nations are going to be the superpowers in innovation? Are those going to be the ones that are currently dealing with, are good in Horizon 1 technologies, or are they going to be the ones in Horizon 3 technologies? So that's one example. In terms of within health, you know, traditional system, Horizon 1 is looking after sick people in hospitals. But what happens when you've got advanced pharmaceuticals? What happens when you've got electronic devices? And what happens when you move to data being the thing that determines health and wellness outcomes? And one example during the pandemic now is, you know, we're rushing around doing things like putting face masks on. But the thing that we find in China and in Asia, more generally South Korea, and that is apps, data, knowing people where people are, knowing when they've been in touch with an infected person, knowing that we can track and quarantine and then plan your way out of this. We're seeing it having a bigger effect on people's health and wellness and on the economy than necessarily having the just looking after the sick people after we've got a problem. And we're seeing that in other sort of areas of health and wellness and that as well. Retail, as we've seen the trend in retail, high street stores has been going down for a number of years. We've seen the rise of online sales and deliveries. And an interesting perspective on that from China was that when China went through the SARS pandemic in 2003, that was the basis of when Alibaba and JD.com, which are now massive online sales, delivery, e-com businesses, that they really took off. And during this pandemic, we're seeing now that robot deliveries, unmanned retail stores are now sort of in that delivery space, having the basis for the developments and innovation and that within China. And my perspective would be that during this pandemic, the West, Europe, the US, in its online e-commerce is catching up to where probably China was 5 to 10 years ago. The interesting aspect now is, what's the new experience going to be? And the things we're seeing in China with online retail, online sort of virtual stores, online personal sort of assistance, and that helping in that in areas is ahead of what's happening in that sort of within the West. And the more general digitization, so professional services, doctors, accountants, moving to online services, to artificial intelligence taking over in a lot of these areas. And I would recommend, for some of you who haven't seen it, Kai-Fu Lee is a writer. He was head of Google in China. He wrote a very good book called AI Superpowers, where he compares the US to China. And when Samantha and I were in Shenzhen in November, we met the Kai-Fu Lee, their Sino Ventures investment fund. And one of the interesting insights they'd said is they'd stopped doing any AI investments now in the States because they felt it was too far behind what was happening in that within China. So an area which I would recommend you have a look at if you want to understand what China's plan on innovation is they publish on a 5-year basis the 5-year plans. They're on the 13th 5-year plan. The 21 the next 5-year plan is due to be published March next year. And this outline, so this document is about a 200-page document. I was running a session for for some of our corporate clients in GE in Paris last year, and I took along this guide to these senior investment people who've got so one of them has got an investment fund of £500 million investing in new tech. And to be honest, I was shocked when they said they hadn't seen this sort of plan, because if you go into it about electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, greening, the environment, the Chinese government set out what their plans are for the next 5 years and within that. So this is the one that was published back in 2016. And you will see the sort of the plans and the aspirations that they've had and published for their country and their economy. So I think it's really important for us to really understand, for us to learn and understand these new markets. So, what's the UK, the US relative to China and India, and getting an understanding in that there, and whether that's to compete or whether that's to collaborate or whether that's to to develop our sort of strategies. Now, in that context, I outlined in my book three things really relating to China. What I sort of described as the Great Wall of China, and it's really about the Chinese markets it can be quite different, and that to the West. And for a long time, Western corporates have been throwing products over the wall in terms of saying, oh, well, these are our brands, these are our products that we've used in the West, we'll just sell them to China, and thinking China's one big market where it's very different east to west. The other thing that China has done, and it's partly been seen as the West for censorship and control, they've had their internet wall, the Great Chinese sort of firewall. But what that has also done is provided an environment where China has developed its own sort of internet ecosystem with BAT, as it was called, Baidu, the search engine, Alibaba, the e-com, and Tencent, the social media, is the big areas they're in. But ByteDance and TikTok now also you could add in that sort of area. So what I would sort of describe as the Great Wall of China is one of the areas to consider. The next trend that I think has been happening with China is what I termed back over 10 years ago now, what I termed the New Silk Road. So this was before the sort of one bridge, the Belt and Bridge strategy that China's had for its manufacturing. But to me, this is about how China has moved from a low-tech, cheap plastic, toys, white goods, electronic goods, to now the most sophisticated sort of goods. And a challenge we've got now, as we're seeing in a number of sectors, is if we wanted to produce mobile phones, drones, solar panels, that technology and capability in the next generation manufacturing is now being led by China in a lot of these new areas. And this sort of trend, again, recent figures and that from The Economist, showing the global manufacturing sort of value, how that has shifted to China. So from when I started going to China, so 17 years ago, China was comparable to its manufacturing to Germany. Now it's well ahead of the West of those sort of countries and that within the comparisons. So the quality and the quantity has sort of increased. And the strategy for doing that, I outline in the book one example of their industrial strategy around like wind turbines, and also you can see it within solar panels and within cars. They've had the strategy of partnering with Western companies, understanding the manufacturing, understanding the IP, and then developing the capabilities. My third one is sort of a bit more future looking. Well, it was future looking back 8 years ago, but now I think probably the dragon has entered. So China is going to become dominant in this example, in this illustration, in telecoms, high-speed trains. So high-speed trains in China now, there's 2 to 3 times as much kilometers of high-speed trains in China than the rest of the world put together. Solar panels, they're leading. Now, this was the first cartoon that Mike Brooks, who's my cartoon guy who makes these cartoons and that for me, when I said, Mike, do me a Chinese dragon with these elements. And he produced this. And when I produced this in China, they started laughing. And they said, oh, but that's not a dragon. That was a lion. This is the Chinese dragon. So the rise of Chinese capabilities, and that built on their industrial strategies, built on the capabilities and the education that they've been building up. So just some very brief examples now of putting that into illustration. There's a video that I'll give you later, which you can go and have a look at, what I term 1 billion teenagers in China. So there aren't literally 1 billion teenagers, but they're all acting like teenagers. They're all on their mobile devices, all ages. They're all doing mobile payments. They're all doing e-com. They've all got electric scooters, 300 million electric scooters, electric mopeds, and that in China. So when you start thinking about the capabilities for driving out EVs and stuff like that. Payments platforms, mobile payments, using QR codes just on your mobile device. So you don't need physical things in stores. You can just do these on your devices. Now, Alibaba developed this about 7-8 years ago to be able to meet the fact that they were driving out e-com and the Chinese didn't have credit cards. So now, over half of the transactions in China, going back a couple of years ago, were just on mobile payments. And as a Westerner, if you travel in China now, it's virtually cashless. It's extremely difficult to use cash now in a lot of places in China, because everything's expected to be sort of on your mobile sort of phone, which that is difficult in some ways, but it brings a lot of power to you as an individual, to companies, for social media, for adding value and that to the services that you're providing, and also helps out in fighting the pandemic, because people are used to now carrying a device which has got QR codes, which will now track your health and wellness and whether you've been infected or been somewhere where somebody might be infected. The final example I want to give is a bit of a case study, but Samantha and I have worked in a number of other industries using a similar sort of thing about these value chains. So the value chain moving from internal combustion engine, which is a metal box with a hydrocarbon engine with rubber tires, to a sophisticated digital device, is going to be transformative, similar to health, similar to vaping, similar to other sort of industries. But taking the example of electric vehicles, so China leads the world in terms of its manufacturing and purchase of electric vehicles. It's add the rest of the world together and it comes up to about the level of China. The penetration is not as high at the moment. Norway has got the highest penetration, with probably over 50% of the vehicles purchased last year were electric vehicles. And Samantha and I were in Oslo in September, October last year, and saw that sort of transformation. And China is on that path. It's interesting that Tesla, Elon Musk wanted to build Teslas in China. He asked for planning permission and permission to do that in October 2018. They started the construction in December 2018, and last December, the factory was up and running near Shanghai, producing 150,000 vehicles per annum. So from a greenfield site to manufacturing in sort of less than a year. And one of the businesses that I did on a podcast recently, WM Motors, based out of Shanghai, they're producing electric vehicles. Their lockdown for the pandemic was part of the Chinese New Year, but they were back open and manufacturing by the second week of March. When I did the interview with them, they were back up and manufacturing. And also another thing that Samantha and I saw when we were in China was the charging stations in Shenzhen, where BYD is based. There were 180 100 kilowatt chargers in one car park, and there were dozens of these car parks just in Shenzhen. So the scale and the speed of these things along this new value chain, so the material sourcing, the assembly of batteries, the charging infrastructure, the recycling. This has already been done at scale and at speed within China. And this is replicated in lots of other industries. We had on the introductions earlier, a person was saying about we're interested in the intellectual property, the patents, and that. We did some research with Rouse, they're an intellectual property law firm, and we looked at the patents that were being filed by Chinese corporates. So this is comparing just, this is in battery technology, CATL, which is a relatively new startup, versus Panasonic, and the quantity of patents that they now are implementing. And this is BYD, one Chinese car manufacturer, their patent families, 1,400 patent families in the electrification and hybrid sector compared to Tesla's 95. Now, one of the people who contributed to my book was Ian Harvey. He's on my advisory group within AIMAVAR. Ian was the chief executive of BTG, British Technology Group, where Margaret Thatcher spun out the research from UK universities. And Ian's been a passionate believer in the value of IP, and he wrote and created the IP program for Tsinghua University in Beijing. And he's written a very good paper, which I'll happily share with people, which looks at the transformation of the Chinese patent and IP area. And his evaluation is China has now got a world-leading IP and patent approach. It's cheaper, faster, and more rigorous than the German systems or the Chinese or the US type systems in terms of being able to protect IP. And China's been on that path now of becoming an IP-rich sort of type country and wants to protect its IP and wants other countries to be able to protect theirs and that as well. So that's a bit of an overview in terms of where I think the trends in innovation are going, how China is going about its strategy with it, and giving some examples under payments and giving some examples under electric vehicles. There's a lot more China insights on our YouTube channel, and there's some public domain ones there that Samantha and I have put in when we visited charging stations and NIO, another electric vehicle business. But we've got lots of other stuff that we've done around facial recognition, unmanned shops, robot deliveries, and things that we've done when we visited sort of Tencent. Other resources that you might be interested in, I've done a series of podcasts over the years, and some of the China ones we've done recently, like Min Zhao, we did a couple of months ago. She runs a fund out of Shanghai, which has got 6 Western corporates investing in that fund. As I said there with Rupert Mitchell from WM Motors, we did at the beginning of March. So there's resources in that there. So that's it for my presentation and sort of content.
During the live session, we had discussion and questions, which we've edited out for confidentiality reasons. Feel free to watch part 2, where we discuss with Professor Yiping Lu of Henley Business School aspects of the China innovation process.